Hello, everyone. Thanks for waiting for a few minutes as we let a couple people have the opportunity to join a few minutes late. Thanks again for joining us for part 2 of our Conservation Finance for REPI Partners webinar. This session is going to be a case study session, and because we have a small group with us today, we're hoping to make it a little bit more interactive. And in the past webinar, I had kept the lines muted and asked people to only ask questions via chat. Once we get started, I'm actually going to unmute everyone's line so that you're welcome to chime in if you have questions as we go, just to make it a little bit more interactive. And you're still welcome to send questions via chat if you prefer it that way too. So just as a reminder, I'm Michelle Haynes. I'm the Program Associate for Strategic Initiatives here at the Conservation Finance Network, and I'm joined by our Director, Lee Welton.
Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us on a Friday afternoon. We'll try and keep this as interactive as possible.
And also with Lee and me today is Reggie Hall, the Director of Conservation Loans at the Conservation Fund.
Howdy, all. Look forward to chatting.
So just as a reminder, if you do decide to send questions through the chat, you can direct them at a specific presenter to the entire audience, or even chat among participants. And the dial-in number and passcode are in the email that had the webinar link if you haven't found that yet. And as a reminder, both presentations will be recorded and uploaded to our website, I imagine about a week after we wrap this last session today. And then, so if you or anyone you know is interested in viewing these recorded webinars, they can go onto our website and find this series as well as the Finance 101, the Basics of Conservation Transaction series we did 2 weeks ago under the Media tab. There you can also find Nature's Return webinar series presented by CBAY that addresses the growing importance of ecosystem service, valuation, and investment. So I think that covers it for kind of opening notes, so we can go ahead and kick off our part 2 case studies.
Oops, if I can get my, there we go. So part of what we're hoping to do today is just to recap very quickly some of the content information shared last time around, get you back in the mindset and mind frame of where we were. So we talked last time about our somewhat catch-all definition of conservation finance, meant to be inclusive of a very broad range of strategies that attempt to monetize environmental goods or services in some form. That could be cost savings, that could be generating some cash flows, or where you have land and resource appreciating in value over time. And again, our punchline is that at the end of the day, someone, whether it's a municipality, taxpayer, water utility, donor, public agency, what have you, someone has to pay for the environmental good or service. We talked about some of the major transaction types and business models, whether that's new or leveraged funding. Believe it or not, there are actually ways to create new pots of funds or stretch those that exist. Environmental credit markets, where you're selling a unit of conservation in some way, shape, or form, be it forest carbon, soil carbon, water quality, quantity, etc. Cost savings and risk reduction, making money by saving money or never spending the money in the first place. That could be increasingly commodity supply chain improvements. We're seeing a lot of movement from corporates in the sustainability and conservation and agriculture. Technological innovation, we're seeing new applications of satellite imagery and smart sensor technology, making certain project costs feasible for us all to do work that needs to be done. Outcomes-based or pay-for-success models, where you're trying to contract for project outcomes or raise upfront funds. Conservation-oriented approaches to real asset investments, so those are your more traditional conservation-oriented timberland investments or farm and ranch land investments. And then there are those, cherries on top, those additional tools that really help to stick some of these pancake layers together, if you will. Be they consumer-driven certification programs, FSC, SFI, forest designations, USDA organic labels for many consumer packaged goods, and then the bread and butter of the land and resource conservation community, the conservation or agricultural easement, and favorable tax incentive. So we're going to drill in on a few of these specifically today. We talked about our wedge slide, bucketing the simple, moderate, and difficult approaches based on effectively the amount of complexity, the amount of legal structuring you would need, lawyer time, if you will, to be able to pull one of these off. And Reg, we're going to get into a couple of the different tools and mechanisms as far as case examples where REPI, and in REPI landscapes, they've been put to effect. But do you want to hop in and give your spiel for why this concerns the REPI audience?
Yeah, totally. So REPI is a really important piece of the conservation finance matrix. And so many of us around the country that are fortunate enough to be involved with our military partners, whether directly adjacent to the installation or in a buffer zone or as part of the Sentinel landscape. It's just a really important piece of funding and piece of the pie, if you will. Projects are just getting more and more complicated, more and more expensive, and we can't just do them on our own. It requires partnerships and layer cakes of funding. And one of the outcomes of this series of sessions is just helping you orient of kind of where you are in the space and where other funding potentials are that are out there, whether in real world examples or perhaps something to think about for the future, but just kind of how everything fits together. So helping to expand your perception and how you all fit in the space. We could go to the next slide. So today, really taking the day in this session to drill down into some specific examples and then brainstorming about future. We've seen this conservation finance technique used here with another agency and partner. Is there a way to bring that to the REPI landscape? So lobbing out some big picture ideas towards the end of the day. Right now, we're going to get into some specific case studies on a couple of different installations. Actually, could you back up one? Real quick, Fort Stewart, we talked about it last time, a buy, protect, sell model where there's an acquisition of a large landscape scale sized patch of forest land with some really interesting community outcomes. Fort Harrison is a blended finance example where there's REPI dollars, county open space, and there's a timing issue. Fort AP Hill example is a cultural resource mitigation example. And then finally, Camp Landing, with potential issues on post, working with a larger partnership to, address the challenges of on-post mission and executing on that. So let's move ahead to Fort Stewart, and we'll go to the next one and get to the map for the orientation. So down in Georgia here near the coast of Fort Stewart, and in particular, what we're focusing on here are the 3,000 acres in red. Those are 4 separate tracts that are more than 3,000 acres. And back in 2011, they were owned by a industrial-sized forest land investor, Rayonier Timber, and they were available and on the market. And so you've got a priority acquisition here for Fort Stewart. And, you know, how do you acquire a multi-million-dollar acquisition that's in your priority zone? You know, how do you conserve that? So this is an example of engaging outside partner. In this case, it was the Conservation Fund in our Working Forest Fund program, but this could have very easily been a private sector impact investor. We talked about those a little bit last time, where you've got private capital coming in to acquire these real estate assets, working with the REPI partner to secure, you know, conserve the properties with the sale of an easement, and then the encumbered, protected, conserved land is sold back into the private sector for continued production and management. So in this instance, the 3,000 acres, you know, this is more than a $3 million acquisition. And so the Conservation Fund, we've got one of our programs is called the Working Forest Fund, where we are raising capital. We just raised another $150 million at the end of last year through a green bond. But we're using these funds to buy and acquire landscape scale size timber tracts across the country with the goal of managing them sustainably, conserving them, and then selling them once conserved back into the private sector to keep them in production so we can revolve our dollars into the next project and address the loss and subdivision of America's forest lands. So here, how did we make this work? How does REPI fit in? So we acquired these 4 parcels knowing that they were a priority for Fort Stewart. And if you want to go to the next slide, we can kind of look at the breakdown here. You know, so total purchase price is actually $4.7 million. We have a number of revolving pools of capital, so we're constantly revolving these dollars through projects. So we deployed some of those dollars to acquire the property. We then sold a conservation easement through the REPI program, and then sold the encumbered land back into the private sector. And in this particular instance, there was one of the tracts, the Durham Banks tract, was about 1,000 acres, and it was of interest to a local community-based nonprofit. If you want to go to the next slide. So here we've got, I think you might need to click again. We've got the group Macintosh Seed. They were interested in one of the parcels, and Macintosh Seed is a nonprofit whose goal is to strengthen low-wealth families and improve rural communities in their region through asset-based economic development. Their idea and their vision was to someday acquire a large enough piece of property to manage and create a community forest. And by managing the community forest, harvesting timber, generate revenue for to pay for the programming that they are providing to their community. So, you know, one of our programs acquired the site, secured the conservation easement, conserved the property, and then the conservation loans program provided a loan to this nonprofit, Macintosh Seed, to acquire the site, and actually created the nation's first community forest that is for the benefit of an African American community. Really, the motivation here is just the historical lack of access to public conservation programs and services by a socially disadvantaged and limited resource producer. And so we had a nice little nexus here of helping the nonprofit acquire an asset, and they wouldn't have been able to do that if it wasn't for the key role that the ACUB REPI program played in effectively conserving the property, reducing its value, and making it affordable for the next generation landowner that wants to keep it in production. Let's see here. Any questions in the chat? I see a question from Scott. How do you own a property and also have an easement on it at the same time? I believe the easement went to the cooperative agreement holder for Fort Stewart. I don't recall it was us. I think it was another land trust that held the conservation easement. Sometimes when you do have those situations where you perhaps are a nonprofit and you own the land and you hold an easement, there's this thing called the doctrine of merger. Essentially you're trying to, how do you kind of hold and manage an easement, and enforce it against yourselves? Ideally, the easement is held by another entity, so there is that separation. Sometimes you're doing that simultaneous transaction where you're selling the property and you're holding the easement to make sure that the property is going to be conserved in the future. So sometimes there is that merger, but for a very short amount of time. Let's see. Let's move on to Fort Harrison out in Montana. So if you could advance the slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. Beautiful. Let's see. Moving out to Fort Harrison in Montana. This is the urban development there. That is, I believe, Helena, Montana. And here in red, if you can see Fort Harrison, and then in red, the parcels in question, 555 acres, both properties owned by developers, both slated for large-scale residential developments along creeks that are the drinking water supply for Helena. They're a priority for the county, the city. Fort Harrison wants to see them conserved. So, and as well as the local land trust, the Prickly Pear Land Trust. And so there is this wonderful nexus and kind of joint vision for seeing these two properties conserved. The challenge is they are owned by developers, they're available. You got to close on these projects faster than the funding may be in hand. And so here we've got an interesting blended finance strategy where Fort Harrison had some REPI dollars available when prior to the closing on the property, but they didn't have enough to acquire a conservation easement and really fully participate in this project. And so what happened was the land trust was on point and structured and kind of really brought all the funding, as I mentioned earlier, complex transaction, multi-million dollars involved here, and different funding sources, each with a different time frame of when they'd be available, each with a different set of strings attached. And so how do you bring them all together? The unifier in this case was the local land trust. And so they had identified the funding. There was a really strong likelihood they were going to get a next year allocation of REPI at Fort Harrison. And so the land trust worked with our conservation loans program to borrow the money to acquire the tract, and then had the time to allow and bring all the different funding sources together. So I think in the end, Fort Harrison wound up bringing more than $1 million of REPI to the table here, if you want to advance to the next slide. And the outcomes here are, a park system has been created. So you've got this really high quality public park system with recreational trails. And excuse me, this example is frequently held up as an example of community conservation and in particular where you've got the local municipality, the local open space funding coming together with the REPI dollars. There's a park created, and as I recall from this project from a few years ago, this is of great use and value to a number of the wounded warriors and other veterans that are recovering in the local hospital. The ability to get out on some of the trails on these park properties, whether it's for physical therapy or just a break from treatment. So just another example here, and one of blended finance. And there are many like this elsewhere across the country where you've got these different sources of funding coming together, sometimes through borrowed money to bridge funding gaps, to bridge time gaps, but to meet the closing date and deadline that the landowner needs to hit. Otherwise, the opportunity for conservation may be lost. Let's move on to Fort A.P. Hill. Let's see, Fort A.P. Hill. In this particular instance, what we've got is, a very active ACUB program with priority acquisitions. And through BRAC, Fort A.P. Hill was going to have to do some construction. And Fort A.P. Hill, located just southwest of Fredericksburg, Virginia, there was a lot of action in the area from a cultural resources standpoint, especially during the Civil War. And in particular on post, as I recall, Civil War trenches from battles and defense of camp, I think from the siege of Fredericksburg, were on the property on Fort A.P. Hill. They were going to be impacted by the construction. And so there was, going to have to go through a whole process. And so what we wound up doing here as partners with Fort A.P. Hill is we engaged the local SHAPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, and also the National Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, HIP, to think creatively. So if you want to advance to the map, here we've got the map that shows Fort A.P. Hill, the priority ACUB buffer areas, and in particular at the top, the red arrow there's a large parcel that's red and green, 1,500 acres of plantation along the Rappahannock River, and incredibly historic property over many centuries. It was on the National Register of Historic Places. And in particular, what was interesting here is we all worked together, and the Army succeeded in getting modifications in the FY08, so this is a little bit of an older project, NDAA, and included the authority for services to enter into cooperative agreements to expend funds off post to manage cultural resources when adversely impacting mission. So let's advance to the next slide. Just a photo. This is actually a structure on the property, old slave quarters. Let's advance to the map. And so what this map shows here is, again, the installation, the property, but those yellow crosses are actually a whole nother layer of cultural significance. Those are contact period indigenous community villages from the time of John Smith when he was exploring the Chesapeake Bay. If you want to advance to the next slide, and in particular, the brown hatch mark in the upper right on the property along the river, that is the village site that was in question. And so, long story short, the Army was impacting Civil War trenches. They were not incredibly significant from a national perspective, but they were triggering a need to potentially mitigate they provided funding for us to acquire a conservation easement on this property, the Camden Farm, to conserve the cultural resources of this contact period village site. So we're offsetting and mitigating, almost apples and oranges here, a Civil War site for a contact period village site, separated by 250 years in time roughly, and managed to do it, accelerated the process for the on-post construction, and so just an interesting little creative way to accelerate the process and achieve some conservation off-post. Let's see, have I triggered any questions yet? I don't see any. So for that, I'll turn it over to Michelle to take us down the Camp Blanding.
Thanks, Reggie. So the next example we have for you is the Camp Blanding Joint Training Center. And just a note off the bat here, you'll see in the bottom of this screen here that the Camp Blanding actually was awarded the 2019 Secretary of the Army Environmental Award for Natural Resources Conservation for large installation. And we'll get into a little bit of why they received that award, in part because of the creative strategies that they have used to finance both mandatory and voluntary conservation activities on this installation, in part to preserve their military mission. So Camp Blanding, for those unfamiliar, is located roughly between Jacksonville and Gainesville, and happens to be sandwiched between two national forests, the Osceola National Forest and Ocala National Forest. And this stretch of land between the two national forests is a priority wildlife corridor for the state. The installation itself is about 7,300 acres and is a mix of habitat that includes woody, swampy, and sandy terrain. And on the installation acreage, you can find 40 federal or state listed animal and plant species. Because of this, the unknown potential costs associated with the required direct land use or management changes if additional species were to become listed or if they were upgraded from threatened to endangered, combined with cost of delays or changes to activities that are critical to the mission, is a source of risk for Blanding. So if you can go to the next slide. So that's why they've come up with some creative strategies to finance conservation on this installation, which we have broken out here into two different categories of strategies. So we mentioned in our presentation on Wednesday that along with different buckets of funding, including public, private, and philanthropic, we also have the category of blended finance. So Blanding is an example of some successful public-public partnerships as well as public-private, and I'll talk a little bit about the ones listed here. So first off, an example of a public-public blended financing strategy. So this one is a little different than your kind of traditional financing strategy. It's called a candidate conservation agreement with assurances. So the Florida Army National Guard, along with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Committee and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, developed this approach to integrate the natural resource conservation activities on Blanding from the perspective of land management with a military use component built into the land design, rather than attempting to protect one species at a time in a reactionary fashion. So the service, the military, and the FWC signed this candidate conservation agreement with assurances to boost the base's conservation efforts and keep nearly 24 at-risk fish and wildlife species off of the endangered species list. And under the CCAA, Blanding essentially voluntarily commits to conservation actions to help stabilize or restore a plant or animal, which helps to preclude the need for a threatened or endangered listing. So in return, the military gets regulatory certainty and a promise that, you know, even if a plant or animal was added to the threatened or endangered list, the training may continue apace. Essentially, the installation is effectively exempt from future species mitigation requirements, and the enormous scope of this agreement shields Blanding from species changes due to even non-military causes such as climate change. So not a straightforward financing strategy per se, but the avoided costs that Blanding secures through this agreement, I think is a pretty successful strategy, and one of the reasons why Blanding was awarded that award in 2019. So this is just a map to show kind of the scope of the habitat that is enrolled under the CCAA. If you look at the map here, you could see that that's easily 60 to 75% of the installation that has enrolled habitat under this program. So just kind of the scope of habitat that Blanding is dealing with that have those endangered or threatened species on it really kind of highlights the need for a program like this, and also highlights the potential scale of impedance that could happen if they weren't covered under an agreement like this, and let's say a few species were moved from threatened to endangered on the Blanding installation. And just on the left is a list of some of the covered species and the enrolled lands that just kind of break down that map for the installation lands. So one other tool or technique I wanted to mention here, we talked a bit in the other examples about creative financing or conservation financing for acquiring priority ACUB parcels. And at Blanding, the example here really talks about how to utilize that ACUB land as well. So what Blanding has been able to do is, at present, the ACUB lands around Blanding encompass more than 25,000 acres. And so the Florida Army National Guard has around 9.6 million in wetlands mitigation credits from those lands. And so if you look at I think as of 2006, they were at half that acreage, and the military itself has leveraged only about 1.5 million funds, and that was leveraged with 42 million in partner funding. So if you were to just kind of look at the numbers there, 1.5 million put in from the military to get even to half of that kind of 9.6 million in mitigation credits, it's really kind of showing the possibility of utilizing that ACUB land. Yeah. Also wanted to note here, we brought up in our part 1 talking about species banking. Just wanted to mention here that at Blanding, they actually got a permit to manually relocate their gopher tortoises onto their ACUB lands, which is another avoided cost here from having to buy credits from a private mitigation bank. So lastly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the public-private partnerships that are ongoing at Blanding. And a lot of them are ways to further utilize the land that Blanding already has. You see here we have a couple interesting images of some bees, some palmetto berries, and a mature forest here. So the pine stands that already existed on Blanding lands, they were originally doing some timber harvesting to get some cost from that land. However, the thinning of that forest and the kind of declining forest health, along with some species such as the red cockaded woodpecker that are found on those lands, made it so that continued timber harvest was not exactly the most sustainable plan for Blanding. So what they were able to do is palmetto berries were found to be readily available on the land to be able to harvest. And so what they did is opened up the palmetto berries for harvest each year for pharmaceutical companies, and that actually generated about $480,000 per year, and that is a naturally regenerating resource for Blanding. So this harvest supplements the declining forestry revenue, and also that revenue helps to sustain environmental programs, using a resource that essentially requires no special restoration. Also on the lands, they have a honeybee propagation project where honeybees that are also used to pollinate the palmettos and generate more berries. Blanding receives a fee for hosting the beehives on this land. And lastly, another kind of partnership program here is that I guess this is less of a public-private partnership, but essentially Blanding's in-house prescribed fire program that does prescribed burns on the installation saves the installation between $100,000 and $150,000 each year from needed outside contracting to do that prescribed burn. And I think that brings us to our next example.
Sure. So this is Lee here. Haven't seen too much activity in the chat box, so just a quick plug as we're going. If anything's unclear, if you want us to dig a little deeper, we are here in service to you and your ability to understand what the heck it is we're talking about. So do let us know if there's anything we can do to make the webinar a little more full, rich, and deep as we go. I'm going to talk about two different instances of not necessarily something that REPI has done, but by our estimation, something that REPI is not necessarily precluded from doing, or in the case of a voluntary surcharge program, something that our REPI partners are not precluded from doing. So we are borrowing from the U.S. Forest Service through the National Forest Foundation. They have two instances of a voluntary surcharge program that they operate on behalf of the Forest Service, the Ski Conservation Fund and the Forest Stewardship Fund. And yet I can't advance my own slides here. All right. So we talked about this the other day. A voluntary surcharge in concept is quite simple. It's a voluntary or discretionary small percentage or fee added to a consumer's bill. So that could be 1% added on the sales receipt. That could be, $1 or $2 per hotel night stay. There's plenty of flavor and color in how these things are set up across the country. And in this case, the National Forest Foundation, which is the Forest Service's congressionally chartered nonprofit arm to help engage communities, administer private funds and gifts for the benefit of and on behalf of the National Forest System. The National Forest Foundation actually administers these two voluntary surcharge programs and aggregates the management of them centrally, such that it's a pretty, I would say, efficient program in getting money to each national forest where there are participating businesses. Relevance to REPI, I think it doesn't go without saying. We should really point out why we think something that the Forest Service is doing should be considered by some REPI partners. It could be a source of match for any type of restoration program or even for some acquisition costs. It could be set up such that it maintains and supports existing land use in a given geography. So if there is some compatible land use in the form of outdoor recreation and tourism, that could be hunting, hiking, kayaking, whatever the case may be that's keeping the economy in place in support of maintaining those compatible uses and perhaps even helping to reinforce the buffer of less compatible uses, shall we say. That can be a way to engage the local outfitter and guide community, other businesses in the hospitality industry, in support of continuing that economic activity in the area and continuing that compatible use. And it can also be targeted in such a way that you're not necessarily asking local residents to be paying or putting up those funds through the voluntary charge added to their bill. But if you do it well, if you do it right, you can in fact target the majority of those micro donations to be gifted by outside visitors coming to an area. So we've seen this work particularly well where you do have tourism in a region, and it's fairly intuitive, where you are asking a customer to have a 1% or $1 charge perhaps added to their $300 ski jacket purchase to continue to make the national forest or ski area where they recreate beautiful, well conserved and managed. So it tends to conceptually follow pretty well, and you avoid hitting up the local residents for all of those micro donations, which, you know, though small, could add up or just be a source of complaint perhaps. So the Ski Conservation Fund, the Forest Stewardship Fund, pretty similar. The Ski Conservation Fund targets ski resorts, whereas the Forest Stewardship Fund targets non-ski resorts. So that could be some kind of other lodge, perhaps for fishing or other forms of outdoor rec. The National Forest Foundation helps those partners set up the charge and then collects those monies. Some programs do it on a monthly basis. I'm actually not sure how the frequency of collection from the National Forest Foundation, but then the National Forest Foundation pools those funds and operates a grant program for on-forest restoration or conservation activities. I do believe the way that the National Forest Foundation has set up the program, they require match for those grants given out, so kind of an interesting inversion of some of that if you consider voluntary surcharge a source of matching funds. But in other ways that this program has been set up, perhaps just from smaller businesses or in communities, sometimes organized by the land trust, sometimes organized by the business itself with a vested stake in perhaps a certain type of agricultural activity or scenic tourism in the area. Those can just be straight grants or gifts from that business or administered by that land trust. Just taking a quick pause, still no questions, so stop us at any time. This is just a roundup, a roundup of where we do have existing voluntary surcharge programs set up between either ski resorts or other types of lodges and the National Forest Foundation. Just about every time we check back for this list, there are new participants being added, so it's fun to see this list grow over time. And the first that we're going to talk about, just to give you a sense of the model, actually stems from a workshop that we did with the National Forest Foundation about a year and a half ago. We brought in Ski Santa Fe to talk about how you might raise funds in support of on-forest restoration activities in the Santa Fe National Forest, which is just adjacent to downtown Santa Fe, if you can believe it. Ski Santa Fe is actually on the forest, and so it was quite well tied in terms of the alignment of the partners here. And we were quite thrilled to see that Ski Santa Fe, on the sale of ski season passes this year, were asking, as part of their participation in the Ski Conservation Fund program, the purchasers of their annual ski pass to opt in, and I'm going to be intentional with my word choice there, to opt in to donate $5 to the National Forest Foundation. In this case, they called it the National Forest Fund. What's kind of cool in reflecting on and speaking to Ski Santa Fe about this just briefly. You know, there's not only the financial component, which on an opt-in basis is going to be relatively small, but it's been a great way for them to talk to their customers, people who love recreating on the National Forest. Obviously, by coming to ski on the National Forest, that is a form of recreation on the National Forest. But to take a vested interest in the financial well-being of the forest, it certainly sounds like Ski Santa Fe is able to communicate to all of those customers at the point of sale or when they get that call, you know, what's this $5 charge, or can you tell me more about this? They're able to talk about, you know, the shortfall in the funds needed for the Santa Fe National Forest to do everything that it needs to do for trail maintenance and infrastructure upkeep and just that backlog that's needed to be addressed. And they've found that sometimes instead of just wanting to contribute $5, they'll have people say, oh, well, gee, I'll put $50 down for that. So it's a great conversation starter. You can understand you have a lot of constituents in the area who probably have an interest in supporting the health and well-being and management and maintenance of the forest that they recreate in. Another thing to note, we talked about this the other day, but we've actually seen the scale of funds be much greater, or at least the participation be greater if you asked for folks to opt out of the donation. So in a world of possibilities, you could imagine that this could have been set up such that $5 is added just kind of alongside, you know, your New Mexico tourism tax and your state sales tax and whatever else you put on the final receipt for your season ski ticket, and then the $5 charge would automatically be applied, and you know, the customer could then ask for the $5 to be removed from the receipt if that was their interest and prerogative. And we just mentioned that world of possibilities because it does, based on the programs we're aware of, seem like the scale of funds is significantly different if you ask people to opt out versus opt in. Our hypothesis is that just has to do with a little bit of social shame. You know, all of us would certainly feel a certain way if we had to have a conversation with the cashier saying, no, I'd rather not add $5 to my $700 ski pass to support the place that I'm enjoying today, or this season, as the case may be. So it certainly seems like other programs across the country are generating, I'd say, just general ballpark up to about $100,000 a year, depending on how many businesses you have participating. The National Forest Foundation sets their threshold for participating businesses in the ballpark of $25,000. That is their estimation of, you know, $25,000 of funds in the door helps them justify the administration costs on the back end of not just working with the participating business and collecting those funds, but then also running the grant program with those funds as collected. So again, this is just the National Forest Foundation's model, but there are plenty of others out there. So you also see Breckenridge had a program like this, has a program, is a participant. They've chosen to do donate $1. And then Pink Adventure Tours, not far from Las Vegas, if you want to get out and explore the desert, also a $1 opt-in donation built into their system. So not necessarily, you know, something that the Department of Defense would ever run. You can infer from this the U.S. Forest Service is not actually collecting, administering, or kind of brokering these relationships with businesses per se. But a partner could certainly consider something along these lines. Benefits, it is, you know, for the effort, a good use of seemingly unrestricted funds, again, depending on how it's set up. You are not asking the business to sacrifice any profit, but you're pushing that micro donation onto the customer, and if structured well, the out-of-town visitor who is there to play. It is a point of communication and education. So that person sitting behind the cash register is having a bunch of conversations every day with people who are beneficiaries of compatible land use, as the case may be. And that revenue stream, though in many cases can be somewhat small, we all know the power of unrestricted funds in catalyzing other activities, fundraising efforts, what have you. Constraints, I think there are only so many businesses who are willing to take this on. In a given community, you'll find that you can max out at a certain point. The flagship for this model was 1% for open space in Crested Butte, Colorado. And they certainly found that, there are only so many businesses in Crested Butte and only so many of those that are interested in participating in something along these lines. It does take some engagement. It does take financial management. You have to continue to connect with the businesses. The businesses have to continue to onboard and educate their staff on those talking points. Each person at the register needs to be able to talk about the program effectively. And though I actually make a hobby of always chatting up folks who work with voluntary surcharge programs to hear their experience of it, but I've found that the folks behind the cash register get a big kick of being able to talk about the cause or to talk about the issue. So notwithstanding that if you've got staff turnover at some retail outfitter or something like that, you got to keep giving people the talking points. But I've found some of the most engaged conversations I've ever had at the cash register revolving around this. That could just be my own enthusiasm, but not sure. So key lessons, we're certainly of the opinion that the opt-out model, if you can structure it that way, is just a better way of generating a larger sum of money, just based on some initial statistics and then also some anecdotal data from folks. We already talked a little bit about, at least from the vantage point of the National Forest Foundation, that $25,000 a year threshold was kind of a sweet spot for what it cost them on the back end to administer the funds and grant program. And then other anecdotal data, it really helps if you have an anchor participant. There was an anchor in that first Crested Butte, Colorado example with the National Forest Foundation. I know that they just need one anchor in a given place, and then they can bring smaller participants on. But, someone who can help them make sure that that $25,000 threshold is met, at least in a minimum, to be operating in a given area. So, there are some thresholds, there are some considerations, but it's, I probably shouldn't call it this, but I certainly think that it's somewhat of a kind of gateway drug, or at least fodder for creative thinking on how you can access people's wallets a little bit differently. Still no questions, so I'm just going to keep barreling on here.
Hold on one sec, Lee. Before you move on, I think there was a question that bubbled up, and in particular, not necessarily on this, but just larger questions on how money flows, I think, was the question in some of these transactions. And, I think it really depends on the sources of the funding, the cost of the funding, and also the timing. And that's where, ideal scenario, you have a patient landowner who is willing to work with the installation, the nonprofit partner, whatever. Time is not an issue. And as the funding comes in, it's set aside until you have everything you need. And then you go and do whatever it is you're trying to do. Like acquire a piece of property, purchase the conservation easement, with the REPI portion and the local matches, what have you. But most of the time, that scenario is hard to find and come by. And so that's where partners come in, and that's where whether they're nonprofit or private sector partners, perhaps a private sector partner buys the land from the owner that can't wait and then becomes the patient seller. Maybe the nonprofit partner buys the land and waits and becomes the patient seller. Other times, partners and others serve as aggregators, and that gets to the blended finance model of kind of, we know we can count on, through our cooperative agreement, we have, I don't know, $500,000 set aside on this for this $1 million transaction. So we've got a local source in that cooperative agreement. That money is in hand through last year's budget. And then we've got a local source over here that's going to provide 25% match. So, that source is tied to an open space fund or something like that. And that source will be in hand in June. And then the landowner is going to donate a small portion. And we've got let's say the voluntary surcharge, a deal with our local brewery or farmer's market. And by the end of August, that's going to have the balance that we need to make this project happen. So at that point, it's kind of the question is, can the landowner wait until all the money's in hand? If they can't, that's where using bridge financing or some cash on hand or maybe a foundation or somewhere else, bridging those time gaps to hit and funding gaps to hit the deadline that is looming, whatever that deadline may be. So a little bit general, I wish we were in person, and at this point I'd be whipping out the easel and using a magic marker to sketch this all out. A little hard to do on a webinar, but happy to answer any questions beyond that, either later on or after this webinar is over. So anyway, sorry to interrupt, Lee.
No, I mean, that's a really key point, Reg, and I think the reason that we start out with that major transaction types and business models layout is just because you really do have a lot of bleeding and stacking of different approaches. There's almost always some component of traditional fundraising, whether from philanthropic or public sources, in this case, REPI being able to serve as a match and also a non-federal match can really do a lot in terms of how you get the whole pancake stack together. But, we go over the taxonomy of how you talk about all these different tools and approaches quite frequently because it's tough to figure out how to convey exactly what Reggie just said while also telling people what certain tools and approaches are. So, you can have all these different strategies in operation. You've got your traditional donor campaign. You've got your public funds in hand. You've been harvesting your palmetto berries or some kind of revenue source from the bake sale, perhaps. Who knows? And, the landowner isn't patient. So then you need the glue and tool of the bridge loan, be it from a conservation organization like the Conservation Fund Bridge Loan Program, be it in the form of a program-related investment from a foundation, some form of loan that helps you to, bridge that period of time to get you to where you need to be with your pancake stack. So I think it's a really key point. Thank you for the question, whoever submitted it. And, lest we're ever presenting any of the tools or approaches in somewhat binary or siloed ways, it really is about how you stick all these pieces together, be it in your landscape or in a particular deal. All right, well, Reg, anything else before we venture into pay for success territory?
No, but I think, looking ahead, I think we've got that useful graphic that kind of shows the flow and how, money moves through these transactions. So, nothing to add.
That's right. This is actually a nice tee-up of sorts. So I guess I'll just maybe take host privilege, and right before moving on from the voluntary surcharge, people might be bored to tears of this. People might think it's entirely too simplistic. But if you're someone who's kind of wondering, well, gee, that seems interesting, where the heck would I start? What we hear from people who have set up these types of programs, you know, it could be as simple as grabbing a coffee date with a potential business that you think would be a really key stakeholder or participant. It could be that you do a happy hour with the business community, with the tourism association, bringing some partners together to really generate maybe a little excitement or momentum around the concept before you actually ask people to participate. So just, you know, thinking about how you put any of this into action, it's just a bit of that. All right, so moving now to South Central Ohio. Again, I'll fess up to being an Ohioan and having a completely biased perspective of increased recreation infrastructure in my home state, and the Bailey's mountain biking trail system on the Wayne National Forest. So, pay for success, we talked about this project approach on Wednesday, also known as outcomes-based financing, also known as performance contracting. Sometimes can even be called environmental impact bond. But effectively, if you kind of boil it all down, it's a contracting model that links the payment to project outcomes. So if you're the project developer, you're only going to get paid when the outcome is achieved. And by setting up the contract that way, you effectively align the incentives. The person who's paying doesn't actually have to pay unless it works. So that shifts the risk of the project performing or not to the private sector partner in place, and actually their dollars are the ones that are at risk. Those investors are providing that available funding. So if you don't have the upfront funds, this can be a way to get those upfront funds to be able to do what you otherwise wouldn't be able to. It can often shorten the time frame, and this one I think is a really key benefit where you're trying to create impact as soon as possible. Obviously, if we need restoration work done, if we need community development done, we want that to happen as quickly as possible. So this can be an interesting tool to potentially fast-track a certain type of project. And then you have measurable economic benefits when you tie payments to outcomes. So a lot of the traditional model has been, you know, there's a problem, okay, here's a grant, go fix the problem. In this case, you're actually saying there's a problem, okay, go solve it, and then if you solve it, I'll pay you for how you solved it. You know, what that means is rather than hoping that the outcomes are achieved, you actually have a measurable outcome achieved. On the constraint side, probably not difficult to infer that these things are not necessarily simple. It can be difficult to find and structure that upfront investment, especially when a longer-term cost savings is how you need to justify it. And you got to be sophisticated enough to get all these players together and to have the money flow through the system effectively. We'll get into the graphic of that in a second. So this model is, I pulled this from Quantified Ventures, colleagues and partners over there, and it's the triangle model that tries to show how your quote-unquote intermediary puts together a deal, gets investor dollars, pays a service provider to go do something, so maybe I should move my mouse around so that helps, pays the, you know, the service provider or the contractor to actually go do the work. That person, once the work is done, reports it out to the person who's benefiting from that work having been done, kept honest by the evaluator, and then the payer pays back that intermediary. Well, if that goes over your head like it did for me the first 3 years I was trying to understand this model, I made Pay for Success for a 5th grader, just nothing else to help my own understandings here. So if you were to take just a really simplified version of this model just to help understand it conceptually, let's say that I'm the intermediary. So I'm structuring the project, I'm pulling it together. I bring money to do that project now. But I actually don't have the money, so I'm using someone else's money. Maybe I'm using Michelle's money since she's sitting across the table from me here. So I pay someone to do the work, and they in fact do that work. Someone that we trust, maybe we really trust Reggie. So Reggie is certifying that that work has in fact been done. The person who's benefiting from that work being done pays me back only after the work's been completed. I take a fee, and then I pay back Michelle in this case, right? Mm-hmm. Not just the money that she put in as the investor, but a little extra as well. And, you know, I was thinking about this earlier today, how simplest to explain it, and I don't know that this really works, but if you imagine someone was trying to sell you on a really new and innovative and different type of a kitchen renovation, and you said, well, gee, if that's real and if that could be in my house, that's amazing, but I don't know that that's a real thing or a type of technology, or I think that that's going to take like 15 years to complete. If you can build that in 6 months, sure, I'll pay for it, but I'm only going to pay for it once it's done. So that person would then be the intermediary, right, in this scenario. They get somebody's money to actually pay the contractors to install the thing. Someone keeps them honest, and let's say they deliver it in 5 months and 5 days under the 6-month budget. I'm thrilled, and I'm happy to pay for my kitchen restoration, a renovation, I should say. So I don't know if that's a really crass way to describe the model, but just in terms of trying to help conceptually convey what it is that people do when they set up a Pay for Success transaction. Oh, the other person gets a little more money than they gave me. Forgot that last box there. So in the case of the Wayne National Forest, again, this is not something that has been tried with REPI as a partner, but in a world of possibilities, certainly seems like it could be a potential project approach for a given project type. So the National Forest Foundation was looking to see where across the country a Pay for Success project could be put in motion for the benefit of the National Forest System. And they settled on this Bailey's Mountain Biking Trail System project on the Wayne National Forest. The mission here being build an 88-mile mountain biking trail system, increase visitation, and allow these downtown communities in a fairly depressed part of South Central Ohio to benefit from job creation, tourism revenue, downtown revitalization, increased hotel bed nights being filled, increased visitation at local restaurants, effectively an economic boost to the communities all sat on the periphery of the National Forest and public land. So the way that they set this up was to do the mountain biking trail infrastructure, that 88-mile trail, up front. So try to build it all as quickly as possible. If you have the funds in hand up front, if you can get the contractors to fast track the work, and if they can build a nice enough mountain biking system, then you can pull in outside visitors from elsewhere. Speaking from my perspective, you know, this would probably be the best mountain biking trail system that I would have drivable access to. So you're pulling in people from Cincinnati, Columbus, Cleveland, potentially Pittsburgh, and that could be really meaningful for these smaller communities in this somewhat depressed part of Appalachia. So service providers here, Wayne National Forest, Athens Bicycle Club, and Applied Trails Research. So those are the folks actually doing the work, right? The payers, those that would benefit from the increased visitation, interestingly, I'll get to the Council of Governments piece, but they include Athens County, the City of Athens, the City of Nelsonville, Bucktel, and Chauncey. So especially if you consider the village perspective, these communities would not be able to pay for all of this project on their own. So all these actors came together and formed a quote-unquote council of governments that is going to pool funds to pay back the investment dollars coming into this. The transaction term is about 5 years, and we'll get into why the timing of that is important. Transaction size was estimated at about $5.4 million. I haven't caught up with Seth over at QV recently, but I think that that's still an accurate ballpark figure at least. And then the potential performance metrics that you could measure for, you know, how many mountain bikers show up? How many non-local visitors show up? Is there in fact an increase in the tax revenue collected? Or is there an increase in the number of registered businesses that are wrapping around, whether it's mountain biking rentals or guiding, or perhaps you have new bed and breakfasts or restaurants popping up, or, you know, tourism shops with curios and other tchotchkes, if you will, to peddle to the out-of-town visitors. And how does this differ from how the project would otherwise need to come together? I think we've all observed these types of projects. The status quo would be you use grants and philanthropy and you complete the project over time. So the estimation for this one is that you'd have to complete it in 5 different phases, that those 5 phases would take approximately 10 to 15 years to complete. You know, you could do 13.5 miles of the 88-mile mountain biking trail system in the first phase, and that would cost somewhere in the ballpark of $360,000 to $590,000. You know, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. And the argument being generally after 15 years, once you have the complete 88-mile system built, then the visitation is, you're you know, cooking with gasoline, you're cracking. So what if you could do all of that work up front? What if you could increase visitation in the nearer term, get the job growth, get the economic revitalization, without having to wait 10 to 15 years and do this kind of piecemeal in phases? And that's the gist of the pay for success approach here. So you've got that single source of upfront funds bringing the partners together. You're able to accelerate that timeline. So you want full visitation, but you don't want to have to wait 150 years, 15 years for those 180,000 potential tourists on an annual basis to come through. So if you think about, you know, the conservative or the aspirational status quo would be 10 years, you know, can Pay for Success deliver this in 5? You have that impact measurement, so you actually know whether tourism and visitation was increased or not. I believe the way that they're measuring this one is to have some periodic trail counting done and to use that as a proxy measurement of whether visitation numbers were as expected, above expectations, or below expectations. And then the Council of Governments would pay a little bit more if visitation was above expectations, and pay a little less if the visitation was below expectations. And then if you think about, you front load that visitation, you get people spending dollars in those downtown communities sooner than later, the estimation of what that benefit would be on a 10-year time period, almost $7 million in higher wages for those communities, over $7 million in increased tax revenue, and $20 million in increased spending. So that would be the estimated economic activity and bump from having this trail system in place, with 66 new jobs for Athens County. So, you know, I think it doesn't take too much a stretch of the imagination to see a vision for which a new trail infrastructure could benefit those communities on the periphery of public lands. And 66 jobs with that type of increased spending in the area would be a pretty nice boost. So I've just colored in the particular players in this particular deal. You've got quantified ventures sticking the pieces together, aggregating, in this case, interestingly, not just investor capital, but some grant capital came through. So some of those upfront funds ended up being grant funds, from what I understand. Then the National Forest Foundation is actually coordinating the trail design and build to get the 88-mile trail system put in place. Ohio University is right there in Athens, so they are keeping the project honest and evaluating whether, whether, how, to what time expectations, et cetera, the trail system is built. And then the Council of Governments, coalesced around Athens County, will then pay back the investor, the upfront investor, through quantified ventures once the trail system is built. This is somewhere in development now. Last time we talked about it, it was about to kick off, so be curious to catch up with Seth and see, where they are with the actual implementation here. But it's a different model for sure. It's a really interesting one. If you have questions, there are a couple different pay-for-success project developers out there. Quantified Ventures and Environmental Incentives are some colleagues and friends of the network. Certainly, I believe there are probably a couple others out there that I'm neglecting, and hopefully they won't be too grouchy with us for that. So we have a few minutes left here. I see that quite a lot of you have stuck through with us to the end, so thank you for that. And yeah, Michelle and Reggie and I can certainly talk amongst ourselves, but if there are some questions, whether that's clarification, whether that's existential questions, I suppose we're willing to accept anything at this point.
Yeah, and just a reminder, I think a couple of lines may have been muted as we went just to cut down on feedback, but all your lines are open again if you want to just chime in with a question or send it via chat. And I think while people are mulling over their questions, with that last example, Lee, going back to the earlier question we had about kind of breaking down the deal cash flow and where specifically the REPI funds would come into a deal like this. So for a pay-for-success model, could you just kind of break it down theoretically, and you can use a kitchen example if you would like, but talking specifically for REPI funding or for a REPI partner, what role would they play in a pay-for-success?
Well, I don't want to get past my skis on that because I don't know exactly where REPI funds, it's pretty flexible authority. So I'd like to imagine that those funds could be used to pay for outcomes, but it just hasn't been done, so I don't know.
Sure.
You would imagine, like the Council of Governments pooling funds pay back the work once it's done, once it's completed. Certainly, and especially among the pay-for-success project development community, there's a big push and quite a bit of advocacy to try and get public entities, federal agencies or otherwise, to pay for outcomes. So I think that's where in that kind of triangle flow chart they would fit in. Great.
Thank you. Yeah, I know that's a bit of a hypothetical, just in terms of, the pay-for-success projects that have been enacted thus far. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, none of them have actually fully completed as of yet in terms of getting all the way to the end of their lifetime.
Yeah, as far as the environmental and conservation application of this project structure, there are certainly a few of them in motion, but we're still, I believe, waiting for the first of them to complete the entire cycle.
Great. All right. Doesn't look like did get just one question that popped up. So question asking about would Pay for Success technically be REPI eligible for prescribed burning on priority base if the land was in an approved area?
So I cannot speak to the specific statutes and authorities to do this, but I can point to a model where folks have been toiling to do just that in the Forest Service context. So if you're familiar with a group called Blue Forest Conservation, they have a version of this type of project model. It didn't, I think, in the end, wind up being a strict Pay for Success project, but they're currently doing a pilot on the Tahoe National Forest in California, which is very much about avoiding potential catastrophic wildfire and reducing fire risk by doing the mechanical thinning and prescribed burning with upfront funds from some investors, some philanthropy mingled in there, I believe, as well. And the water utility, the Yuba water utility, is pitching in. And then after the contracted work is completed, paying that work for the outcomes achieved. And I'm not sure how they measure it. There's quite a bit of literature online about this one. Nifty video came out earlier this week describing Blue Forest Conservation's pilot, but showing whether it's on a per acre basis of treatment or something like that, how the project works.
Great.
And they call it the Forest Resilience Bond is the project name for that type of work.
Great, thank you. And feedback there, great answer. I think that was really helpful. While we're waiting to see if there's any other questions, Reggie, do you have anything you wanted to add to kind of your earlier content or kind of the content that Lee and I have given at the end of the presentation here?
No, I think, you know, part of it, as I mentioned earlier, was just expanding horizons and changing perspectives. And, you know, there may be stuff that we've mentioned either today or the prior day where it may not, you know, admittedly be a great fit for the infusion of REPI dollars or for the installation to be directly involved with. But if there are, if there's, maybe it's a better fit for a partner to generate the ever elusive match dollars for REPI or some other funding source. You know, and if those parties, you know, you heard about something and you say, you tell your local, partner, hey, I just learned about these things, but I don't know a ton about them, you know, happy to have you guys share our contact info with your partners so they can ask us the questions, or we can put them in touch with, folks that would know, how to make a particular thing happen. So, just we're here as a resource for you guys to help move the needle on this topic and, engage in new strategies and explore new horizons.
Yeah, Reg, that's a really key takeaway, I think, from this two-part series altogether. We need to think a little bit more about what tools we have in our toolboxes, what strategies we might use. In some places, you might find that there's a little more creativity with how you stick together the operating funds or project financing to support your work. And that could be, you, or that could be the partnership that you're operating with the local land trust or something like that. But it's I suppose, our hope that you walk away from this two-parter just understanding a little bit more that we're not limited to necessarily just traditional gifts and grants and, public easement dollars to be able to support our work, but to begin to think about what else is out there, what other tools could our partners have at their disposal, could we have at ours, and to hopefully just generate more impact for all the conservation, restoration, and stewardship efforts that, all that work that needs to be done at and near REPI installations.
All right, I think that brings us right to about 3:30, so we will go ahead and wrap it up here. Happy to get to, like last time, if any questions do come up and you want to just send us an email, our emails are here on this Q&A slide. We're happy to take questions that you have and might, you know, come to you a little after the presentation has ended today. So Lee, do you have any last comments before we wrap it up?
I think I've said my piece. Thanks, folks, for sticking with us. Have a wonderful weekend.
All right, thank you, everybody. And one last note just before we hit end here. As I mentioned, the Conservation Finance Network website has a lot of content. Along with this webinar series, we have the Finance 101 series, the Nature's Return series, and also just wanted to mention the Conservation Finance Toolkits that we have. We have kind of 1 to 3 page toolkits that kind of go in depth on certain strategies, some of which we mentioned the session on Wednesday and talked about today as well. Currently, we have toolkits put together on ballot measures, seller financing, bridge financing, voluntary surcharges, conservation partnerships with water utilities, using state revolving funds for land conservation, forest carbon offsets, and pay for success financing. So I encourage you to go check out those toolkits if you were interested in some of the tools that we covered in either of the sessions this week but wanted a little bit more information or a few case studies. So with that, I think we will go ahead and wrap it up, and just one more thanks for attending this webinar series, and we hope that you have a wonderful weekend. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Bye.